It started as just another Tuesday morning in the glossy glass tower of Mendelssohn Dynamics, the kind of company that prided itself on being disruptive in every market it touched. The sun spilled through the panoramic windows of the 35th floor, catching in the polished chrome details and the cold, calculated beauty of the CEO's office. Jonathan Mendelssohn, a man who had built his empire on ruthlessness disguised as vision, stood behind his desk, scrolling through the final draft of a press release that was about to change everything, not just for the company, but for himself. He didn't look up when his wife, Camille, stepped in. Her delicate frame was wrapped in an ivory cashmere coat despite the warm weather outside, and her hand instinctively rested on the curve of her belly. She was 6 months pregnant, glowing in a way that made her look like she belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. Yet beneath that glow was a tightness around her eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there when they first met. Jonathan had been distant for weeks, his gaze drifting toward his phone during dinners, his replies clipped. She had chalked it up to the usual pressures of corporate warfare, mergers, acquisitions, board politics, but the truth, as she was about to learn, had nothing to do with business and everything to do with betrayal. Jonathan, she said softly, closing the door behind her. We need to talk. He finally looked up, but instead of the warmth she hoped to find, his expression was granite. Camille, this isn't a good time. I have a board call in 10 minutes. Her heart thudded in her chest, and she tightened her grip on her handbag. Then I'll be quick. Is there something you're not telling me? Jonathan sighed, leaned back in his chair, and steepled his fingers. I think we both know this marriage isn't working. The words hit her like a slap. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Not working. Her voice wavered. Jonathan, I'm carrying your child. I'm aware, he said, his tone flat. But I've met someone else. Someone I want to be with. The silence between them was suffocating. Camille's mind raced through the possibilities, her breath shallow. Who? She asked, though some part of her already feared the answer. His jaw tightened. Marissa. For a moment, Camille's mind went blank. Marissa, the company's HR director, the woman who had sat across from her at corporate functions, smiling with that infuriating mixture of warmth and calculation. The woman whose job it was to manage people, but seemed to thrive on subtle manipulation. You're leaving your pregnant wife for your HR director. Camille's voice rose, trembling with disbelief. Jonathan didn't flinch. It's not just about leaving. It's about finding someone who understands me, who shares my vision for the future. The sheer audacity left Camille momentarily speechless. She took a step back, her eyes narrowing. Your vision for the future. Does that include discarding people the moment they become inconvenient? This isn't about convenience, he said sharply, as if offended by the suggestion. It's about compatibility. Marissa and I. Marissa and you. Camille cut in, her voice laced with icy fury. Marissa wouldn't know compatibility if it were listed on a benefits package. She's good at smiling when it suits her, but she'll smile just as easily when she's the one holding the knife. Jonathan rose from his chair, towering over her. I don't expect you to understand. I'm filing for divorce. We can handle the details through the lawyers. The words hung in the air like a guillotine. Camille felt the floor tilt beneath her, but she refused to let him see her crumble. Without another word, she turned and walked out, her heels clicking like a metronome of defiance against the polished marble floor. Outside, in the muted hum of the executive hallway, she paused to steady her breathing. Her mind wasn't just on the heartbreak, there was something colder, sharper forming in the back of her mind. Jonathan thought he knew who she was, thought she was just another trophy wife whose value was tied to her beauty and grace. But he didn't know the truth. Camille hadn't married Jonathan for his money or his power. She had grown up surrounded by more wealth than he could imagine. Her father was not just a retired tech mogul but one of the founding architects of Silicon Valley's rise, a man who had quietly bankrolled half of the innovations Jonathan's company now used. Her maiden name, Whitmore, had been deliberately shed when she chose to live outside her family's shadow, opting for independence rather than the constant media glare that followed the heirs and heiresses of old tech royalty. Jonathan had never bothered to dig deep. He'd assumed her elegance and connections came from proximity to him, not from a world that had existed long before he entered the picture. That ignorance was about to become his undoing. Camille took the private elevator down to the building's lobby, the reality of the situation solidifying with each passing floor. She wasn't just walking away, she was preparing for a war he didn't even know had started. Her father's network was vast, filled with quiet but powerful figures who owed the Whitmores favors, favors that could be called in with a single phone call. And as much as she had avoided that life, she was about to step back into it. She could already see the path ahead. The lawyers Jonathan thought would protect him would find themselves outmaneuvered. The investors who propped up his empire would begin to reconsider their loyalties. The HR director he'd chosen over her would learn that stepping into the spotlight could be far more dangerous than she'd imagined. When Camille stepped into the crisp morning air, a black town car was already waiting. Her driver, Marcus, opened the door without a word. He had been with her family for over a decade and knew better than to ask questions when her expression was that controlled. "Take me to Palo Alto," she said quietly as she slid into the leather seat. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, pulling into the traffic with smooth precision. As the city's skyscrapers gave way to the sprawling estates and manicured gardens of Silicon Valley, Camille allowed herself a small, cold smile. Jonathan thought he was freeing himself from a marriage. What he had really done was pick a fight with the wrong heiress. And soon enough, he, and Marissa, would understand that in the world Camille came from, power wasn't flaunted in boardrooms. It was exercised quietly, decisively, and without mercy. By the time they reached the Whitmore estate, a vast, modernist masterpiece hidden behind high-security gates, Camille's mind was already racing with the details. She would speak to her father first, then to the family's legal team, and finally to a select handful of people who could shift the balance of influence in ways Jonathan wouldn't even see coming until it was too late. The gates opened silently, and the car rolled up the long driveway. Camille stepped out, smoothing her coat over her growing belly. She wasn't just a pregnant wife abandoned by her husband. She was a Whitmore, and it was time Jonathan learned exactly what that meant. Of course. Here's an expanded part 2 at about 1,000 words, continuing the drama in a seamless narrative style without any headings. The news hit the glossy, glass-walled headquarters like a thunderclap. Gossip traveled faster than email. No sooner had the CEO's personal assistant whispered the words, "He filed for divorce," than the entire marketing floor knew about the HR director, the late-night office lights, and the lingering glances that suddenly made too much sense. But what no one knew, what no one could have guessed, was that his wife was not just another quiet, well-dressed partner in the background of corporate galas. She had grown up in the kind of wealth that didn't need to be flaunted to be felt. Her father was one of the original architects of the Valley's tech boom, a name whispered with reverence in boardrooms and immortalized in startup lore. He had built companies, dismantled competitors, and funded revolutions in technology. He had also taught his only daughter, from a young age, that true power often lay in being underestimated. When she met the man who would become her husband, she had been living under a carefully constructed alias, her father's surname absent from her records, her trust funds locked away, her life a quiet rebellion against the preordained path of wealth. She wanted to be seen for herself, not for the number of zeros in her inheritance. He had been charming, ambitious, and just flawed enough to seem real. He was building a company then, still in a cramped co-working space, his eyes alight with the kind of hunger she recognized from the stories her father used to tell about the early days. She had believed in him, perhaps even more than he believed in himself. For years, she stayed in the background, letting him take the spotlight, content to see the company grow. She attended events, smiled for photographs, and politely avoided the kinds of women who assessed her like a spreadsheet. When the company went public, She clapped the loudest, though she could not help noticing how many speeches began with I, instead of we. Still, she told herself, marriage was a team sport, and sometimes one player took more shots than the other. The pregnancy had been a surprise, one that filled her with a quiet joy. She imagined a child who might inherit her father's intellect and her husband's charisma, a little life that might anchor them together in ways the IPO celebrations and endless investor dinners never quite had. But as her belly grew, so too did the sense that something had shifted. Late nights at the office became later. Conversations at home grew shorter. His phone, once casually left on the counter, now lived in his pocket, face down, even while charging. The HR director had always been visible. Young, sleek, with the kind of ambitious smile that said she saw the corporate ladder as a personal challenge. She laughed too loudly at his jokes, and her hand lingered on his arm just a beat too long during company parties. But suspicion had always felt beneath her. She believed in dignity, until the day dignity felt like naivety. The divorce papers arrived not as a conversation but as a notification from her lawyer, who seemed almost apologetic to be the messenger. The reason was vague, irreconcilable differences, but the truth was already in circulation. The CEO had chosen the HR director, and not just chosen her, but done so while his wife was pregnant with their first child. It was brutal in its decisiveness, a move that screamed both arrogance and desperation. What he hadn't counted on was the existence of her other life. In his mind, she was a woman dependent on him, cushioned by the trappings of his success, someone who would fade quietly into obscurity once removed from his narrative. He had never asked much about her family, and she had never offered. Why spoil the illusion? But illusions cut both ways, and now the one he'd been living was about to shatter. The first crack appeared when her father's private legal team took over the divorce proceedings. Suddenly, the man who had once spoken with swagger in negotiation meetings was being outmaneuvered in ways he couldn't comprehend. Every clause, every asset, every shared holding was dissected with surgical precision. There were shell companies he didn't know she had partial ownership of, investments in his own business routed through venture firms her father controlled. He realized, too late, that she had been both silent partner and quiet guardian, the invisible scaffold on which much of his empire rested. The second crack came when she stopped being silent. Until then, she had avoided interviews, declined to attend shareholder events without him, and stayed off social media. But one morning, the largest business magazine in the country ran an exclusive, a profile not of the CEO, but of her, complete with the headline, "The Heiress Who Built More Than One Empire." The article revealed her lineage, her investments, her quiet influence across several major tech firms, and her role in stabilizing the company's early days. It painted her not as a victim, but as a strategist whose next move would be watched closely by every venture capitalist in the valley. Suddenly, the power dynamic had shifted. Shareholders, once dazzled by his charisma, began questioning his judgment, not just for the affair, but for alienating someone whose connections and capital had been a hidden asset all along. The HR director, now publicly entwined in the scandal, found herself the target of online vitriol, with employees leaking stories about favoritism and questionable HR decisions. Through it all, the heiress remained composed. She did not trash him in public, did not release scandalous details, did not even raise her voice when they met in court. Her calm was more devastating than anger. It suggested she had already moved several steps ahead, planning a future where his relevance diminished with each quarter's earnings. Her pregnancy, far from making her fragile, became part of the narrative of resilience. She appeared in a charity gala in a flowing silk gown, her hand resting lightly on her belly, smiling for cameras like a woman who had just been handed the winning hand in a game she hadn't been trying to play. Investors who had once courted him now sought her advice. Former allies of his began quietly offering their loyalty to her, sensing where the true gravity now lay. In private, she began something new. Not revenge, she had no need for that, but a venture fund aimed at supporting women-led startups, with a special focus on ethical workplace cultures. It was a pointed move, subtle enough to be framed as philanthropy, yet sharp enough that everyone who knew the backstory understood its true origin. As for the CEO, his marriage was legally over before the baby was born. The HR director became his public partner, though their appearances together had the brittle gloss of something straining to be convincing. The company's stock, once soaring, began to stumble as questions about leadership and culture persisted. He still had his title, but titles, as his ex-wife knew well, were only as valuable as the power behind them. The heiress did not speak ill of him to their child when the time came. She simply told the truth in the same calm voice she had used in court, that sometimes people forget who stood beside them on the way up, and that forgetting is its own downfall. By then, she was already known in her own right, no longer the CEO's wife but a force in the valley, a name spoken in the same breath as her father's. And while the world debated whether the CEO's affair had been worth it, she was too busy building the next thing, her empire expanding quietly, exactly as she preferred. Do you want me to also write part 3 where the CEO tries to win her back but finds she's already orchestrated something far bigger? That could take the drama to an even higher level?